Millionaire CEO comforted crying girl in restaurant and was shocked to learn she was his daughter. Before going into the video, please leave us a like and a subscribe so we have the motivation to make the next videos. A life of control shattered in an instant. Leo Donovan had built his entire world on control. Every decision, every move was calculated, precise, and executed with flawless logic. He had spent years molding himself into a man who never faltered, never allowed emotions to cloud his judgment. That was how he became one of the most powerful business moguls in the country, how he built his empire from the ground up with ruthless efficiency. In his world, there were no surprises, only carefully planned outcomes. But all it took was one evening, one seemingly insignificant moment, for his entire reality to crumble. That night, Leo had no intention of doing anything out of the ordinary. He had spent the entire day buried in meetings, drowning in corporate negotiations, his mind racing with numbers, projections, and strategies. It was a rare occurrence for him to step away from his usual high-end dining experiences and opt for something simpler. Yet for some reason, he found himself walking into a small, family-owned restaurant on the quieter side of the city. It wasn't the kind of place he usually frequented, no VIP treatment, no hushed business conversations. Instead, it was warm, intimate, filled with the aroma of grilled steak and freshly baked bread, the kind of place where families gathered, where laughter replaced the rigid, monotonous tone of executive discussions. Leo barely noticed. He took a table near the window, his mind still elsewhere, still caught up in the carefully structured reality he had spent his whole life curating. He ordered a steak, a glass of wine, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself just sit in silence. And then he heard it, a soft, trembling sob. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of conversations and clinking glasses. But something about it made his attention snap into focus. His gaze shifted across the room, searching, scanning, until he saw her, a little girl curled up near the counter, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped at her eyes with her small fists. She couldn't have been older than 4. Dark curls framed her round face, her pink sweater slightly oversized, as if it had been chosen for warmth rather than style. But it wasn't her presence that made Leo freeze. It was her eyes, bright blue, gay with distress, eyes that mirrored his own. Something deep in his chest tightened, an unfamiliar pull, an unease he couldn't name. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's affairs. He had spent his entire life avoiding personal entanglements, keeping emotions at arm's length. But for some reason, he found himself standing, his legs moving before his mind could catch up. He crouched down beside her, making sure not to startle her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice quieter than he was used to. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him. Up close, her features struck him harder, those same sharp cheekbones, that familiar stubborn tilt to her chin. But it was impossible. "I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Leo felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Concern. Genuine, unfiltered concern. "Lost?" he repeated, scanning the restaurant. "Where's your mom?" The little girl's lower lip wobbled, and she shook her head. "She was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back, but I couldn't find her." Leo exhaled, glancing around, expecting to see a frantic mother rushing toward them. But no one was searching for her. For the first time in years, Leo Donovan felt out of control. He wasn't sure what compelled him to stay, to help her. It wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He had meetings to prepare for, projects to manage, but somehow none of that mattered in this moment. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The little girl hesitated, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her sweater. "Lena." Lena. Something about that name made his chest tighten again. "All right, Lena," he said gently. "Let's find your mom." "Oh, okay." She hesitated for a second, then slipped her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of her touch startled him. He wasn't used to holding something so delicate, so trusting. They walked together through the restaurant, his grip firm, protective, as if he was afraid she would disappear. And with every step, the unease in his chest grew. And then, "Lena!" A woman's frantic voice cut through the air. Lena immediately perked up. "Mommy!" Leo turned, and the moment he saw her, the world stopped. The woman stood near the entrance, her eyes wide, filled with panic. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her hands shaking slightly as she rushed forward. Relief flooded her expression as she scooped Lena into her arms, holding her tightly against her chest. Leo barely heard her murmured reassurances, barely registered the way Lena clung to her, because all he could focus on was her face. Recognition hit him like a freight train. It had been years, years since he last saw her, since they had walked away from each other, leaving nothing behind but silence and unresolved memories. And yet, she was standing right there. His throat tightened. Noelle? She froze, her arms instinctively tightening around Lena as if to shield her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, his name, spoken like a ghost from the past. Leo. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He looked between her and Lena, his mind racing, pieces falling into place, too fast for him to process. The dark curls, the sharp cheekbones, the blue eyes. No, it wasn't possible. His voice came out strained, almost unrecognizable. Noelle. He swallowed, forcing the words out. Tell me the truth. Is she... Noelle's lips parted, her expression caught between guilt and something deeper, something that told him the answer before she even spoke. But when she finally did, it shattered the last piece of control he had left. Yes, she whispered. She's your daughter. The air in the restaurant seemed to vanish. Leo couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His daughter. His. The world had never felt more uncertain, more out of control. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. What would you do if you were in Leo's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Like this story to support Leo in his journey. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional and powerful stories. Nick Hale had faced some of the most ruthless business negotiations in the world. He had built his empire on strategy, on cold calculations, on never letting emotions dictate his decisions. But in that moment, standing face to face with a past he never expected to see again, his entire world tilted off its axis. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Rose. Rose, the woman who had walked out of his life years ago without a trace, the woman he had once believed in, once trusted, and who now stood before him, holding the little girl who had just unknowingly shattered his entire existence. Lena, the child who clung to her mother's neck, relieved and unaware of the storm brewing between the adults. The little girl with his blue eyes. Nick couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Every muscle in his body felt locked, frozen in the moment his past collided violently with his present. Rose's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Her face had gone pale, her expression trapped between fear, guilt, and something else, something even deeper. Nick, she finally whispered, barely loud enough to be heard over the noise of the restaurant. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. It had to be a mistake, a coincidence. It shouldn't be what he thought. But every instinct inside him screamed otherwise. He forced his voice to remain steady, though his pulse hammered erratically. Tell me the truth, Rose. His voice was dangerously quiet, barely controlled, his blue eyes darkening with an intensity that made her shrink back slightly. Is she mine? Rose's grip on Lena tightened. Nick's entire body tensed, the silence stretching unbearably long between them. Every second that passed felt like a slow, torturous blade slicing into him. And then, she nodded. Nick's breath caught. A single word, barely a whisper, left her lips. Yes. The entire restaurant seemed to fade into the background. The voices, the clatter of plates, the distant hum of conversation. None of it existed anymore. Only her words. Only the little girl in her arms, his daughter. A sharp, suffocating weight settled onto his chest. 4 years. 4 years of not knowing. 4 years of missed birthdays, of first words, first steps. A lifetime of moments stolen from him. His fingers curled into his palms, nails pressing against his skin as he tried to process the truth. Why? His voice came out rough, edged with restrained fury. How long were you planning to keep this from me? Rose swallowed hard, shifting Lena's weight slightly as if the motion would somehow shield her from the pain in his voice. I didn't plan anything, Nick. He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. 4 years, Rose. 4 years. Do you have any idea what you took from me? Her gaze dropped for a moment, shame flickering across her face. But then she lifted her chin, something guarded behind her eyes. I did what I thought was best. Nick took a sharp step forward, his patience snapping. Best? His voice was still quiet, but it carried the force of a storm barely contained. For who, Rose? For you? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to erase me from my own daughter's life. Lena shifted slightly in Rose's arms, sensing the tension in the air. Nick exhaled, trying to steady himself. This wasn't about anger. This was about the little girl staring at him with those same bright blue eyes that haunted him in the mirror every morning. He took a slow breath, softening his tone just enough so that it didn't scare her. Does she even know who I am? Rose hesitated, and that hesitation, it broke him. She hadn't told her. Nick took a step back as if the realization had physically struck him. His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing in disbelief. You really kept everything from me. Regret flickered across Rose's face, but she stood her ground. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Nick. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. You weren't trying to hurt me? He gestured toward Lena. She doesn't even know me. I'm a stranger to my own child. Rose's eyes glistened with emotion, her voice quieter now. I was scared. Nick clenched his jaw. Scared of what? She hesitated. And then her voice broke slightly. Scared that you wouldn't want her. The words hit him like a gunshot to the chest. Wouldn't want her? The sheer absurdity of it made his stomach churn. Nick took a slow step closer, his voice raw with something dangerously close to heartbreak. You think I wouldn't have wanted my own daughter? Rose's gaze dropped again, her fingers tightening around Lena's small frame. I didn't know, Nick. You were so focused on your career, on building your empire. I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped, that you'd walk away. Nick let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. You should have let me make that choice. For the first time, Rose had no response. Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Nick forced himself to look at Lena again. She wasn't just some abstract concept now. She wasn't just a secret that had been kept from him. She was real, and he couldn't walk away. His voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, but it carried the weight of a promise. I don't care how we figure this out, Rose. I don't care how complicated it gets. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. But I'm not going to disappear. I am going to be in her life. Rose blinked rapidly as if trying to process his words. Lena, still unaware of the gravity of the moment, tilted her head at him curiously. Are you mad at Mommy? She asked, her voice small. Nick inhaled sharply, forcing every bit of raw emotion down before crouching slightly to meet her gaze. No, sweetheart, he said, his voice steady for the first time since this conversation began. I'm just surprised. She nodded solemnly as if that made sense. Then to his shock, she reached out, tiny fingers curling around his wrist. Nick stilled. Her touch was small, warm, and it destroyed him. For the first time since hearing the truth, the anger drained from his body. He had no idea how he was going to fix this, no idea how to make up for 4 lost years. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. Nick Hale had spent his entire life making decisions, powerful, strategic, carefully calculated choices that built his empire from the ground up. But this was the first time in history that a decision had been made for him, one that had stolen something irreplaceable. 4 years. 4 years of first words, first steps, first laughs, gone. He stood in front of Rose, his chest tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. His daughter, his own flesh and blood, had been growing up in this world without him, and he hadn't even known. Rose stood there, her arms wrapped protectively around the little girl as if shielding her from the weight of this moment. She started, her voice uncertain. She swallowed, eyes darting to the floor as if she couldn't face him. I never wanted to hurt you, Nick. Nick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Then why? His voice was rough, strained, like it was taking every ounce of his control not to break apart right there. Rose tightened her grip on Lily. Because I was afraid. Nick's jaw clenched, frustration flaring in his chest. Afraid of what? She hesitated. Of you, she finally admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Nick's entire body stiffened. Rose glanced up, guilt flashing across her face. Not like that, Nick. I wasn't afraid of you hurting us. I was afraid of what it would do to you, of what you'd choose. She let out a breath, shaking her head as if the words were unraveling faster than she could control them. You were at the height of your career. The deals you were making, the pressure, the travel. You didn't even have time for yourself, let alone a child. Nick's heart pounded against his ribs, but he forced himself to listen. Rose swallowed hard. I was terrified you'd feel trapped, that you'd resent me. Resent her. Nick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, trying to push down the hurt clawing at his chest. You didn't think I had the right to make that choice myself? I thought I was doing the right thing, Rose whispered. Nick let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Right thing? You thought the right thing was keeping my own daughter from me? Tears welled in Rose's eyes, but Nick didn't care about her guilt right now. He cared about the 4 years that had slipped through his fingers, years he could never get back. Do you even understand what you took from me? His voice was quieter now, but so much heavier. I missed everything. Her first words, her first steps. I missed bedtime stories and scraped knees, and he broke off, unable to finish the sentence. He felt it then, the weight of everything crashing into him. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was grief, a grief that had nowhere to go. Rose wiped at her eyes, sniffling. I know I can't fix it. I know I can't change the past, Nick. Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. But I swear to you, I never did this to hurt you. Nick took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the rage and pain inside him were fighting for control. How long were you going to wait? He asked, his voice strained. Until she was 10? A teenager? Until she was grown and didn't need a father anymore? Rose shook her head. No, Nick, I wanted to tell you, I did. But every time I thought about it, you convinced yourself I wouldn't care, he finished bitterly. Rose flinched. Nick looked away, jaw tightening. You never even gave me a chance, Rose. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. For the first time since the conversation started, Nick felt exhausted, emotionally, mentally, because no matter how angry he was, no matter how much he wanted to scream about the unfairness of it all, the damage was already done. The years were already lost. And what was left? A little girl who didn't even know who he was. Nick swallowed hard, turning his gaze to Lily. She was still in Rose's arms, watching them with quiet curiosity, her little fingers playing with the edge of her mother's sweater. She had no idea how much had just changed in his world. He forced himself to speak, even though his throat felt raw. Does she even know I exist? Rose hesitated before shaking her head. Nick let out a slow, shaky breath. Of course she didn't. He clenched his jaw, looking away, his hands gripping the edge of the chair beside him to keep from losing his temper all over again. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it was the calm before the storm. I don't care how complicated this is, Rose, he said, voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. I am going to be in her life. Rose nodded, but Nick saw the worry flicker across her face. He knew what she was thinking. He had spent years running his life with ruthless efficiency. His world had been meetings, numbers, boardrooms, and billion-dollar deals. What the hell did he know about bedtime stories? What the hell did he know about being a father? But he was going to learn, because the one thing he knew for certain, he wasn't going to let Lily grow up believing she didn't have a father who wanted her. He had already lost too much time. He wouldn't lose another second. Nick Hale had built an empire from the ground up. He had fought for every contract, every deal, and every success with ruthless precision. Yet, as he stood in front of Rose, demanding to be part of his daughter's life, he realized this was the first battle that truly mattered. There were no negotiations here, no business strategies, no power plays. This was about earning the right to be in Lily's life, and Nick refused to fail. Rose exhaled slowly, her gaze locked onto him, measuring him carefully. You say that now, she murmured, but Nick, you don't just walk into a child's life after 4 years and expect everything to fall into place. Nick's jaw clenched. I'm not expecting it to be easy, Rose, but I'm not walking away. Rose shook her head. She doesn't even know who you are. The words cut deep, but Nick refused to flinch. Then I'll introduce myself, he said, voice unwavering. I'll take it slow. I'll do whatever it takes. Rose studied him for a long moment, her arms tightening around Lily, who had begun to doze off against her shoulder. She's not just some responsibility you can schedule into your life, Nick, Rose said, quieter this time. She's a little girl with feelings, routines, and a world she's built without you in it. Nick exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He knew this wasn't something he could force. He had spent his life commanding respect, making decisions that shaped entire industries. But this was different. This was Lily, and he had to earn his place. It started small. Rose agreed to let him visit, but only on Lily's terms. No sudden expectations, no overwhelming introductions, just time. And Nick took what he could get. The first time he arrived at their small apartment, he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. He had stood outside the door, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, his heart pounding in a way it never had before, not even in his biggest boardroom battles. Then the door had swung open, and there she was, Lily. Dark curls, bright blue eyes, the same eyes that stared up at him with curiosity, but not recognition. Not yet. She had blinked up at him, her tiny hands gripping the hem of her dress as she tilted her head. "You're the man from the restaurant," she said finally. Nick swallowed, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, DM," he said. "I am." She studied him carefully before glancing at her mother. "Why is he here?" Nick felt something in his chest tighten. Rose knelt beside her own daughter, smoothing a hand over her curls. "Because, sweetheart," she said softly, "he's someone important. Someone who wants to get to know you." Lily's brow furrowed. Then, to Nick's complete and utter surprise, she shrugged. "Okay," she said simply. Then she turned on her heel, disappearing back inside. Nick blinked. That was it? No screaming, no crying, just, okay? Rose let out a small laugh. "She's not the dramatic type," she admitted. "She takes her time figuring people out." Nick let out a slow breath. Then he would give her all the time she needed. Days turned into weeks. Nick showed up every single time. He never missed a visit. Not once. At first, Lily barely paid attention to him. She would play on the floor, coloring while he sat nearby, making quiet conversation with Rose. Then little things started changing. One day, as he was sitting on the couch flipping through a book, Lily climbed up beside him. Not in an obvious way, uh, just close enough for him to notice. Another time, he brought her a small puzzle. She had taken it without a word, but an hour later, she had asked him to help her put it together. It was slow, but she was letting him in. And Nick had never worked harder for anything in his life. One evening, Nick arrived to find Lily sitting on the floor, drawing with crayons. She barely glanced at him as he walked in, but something about the way she hunched over her paper seemed different. Curious, he sat beside her. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Lily hesitated, her small fingers gripping the crayon a little tighter. Then after a moment, she held up the paper. It was a family drawing, a house, a son, 3 stick figures. One was her, one was Rose, and the last one? Nick felt his breath catch. "Is that me?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Lily nodded. "Yeah," she said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Nick stared at the drawing, something deep inside him unraveling. He had made it into her world. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Nick Hale wasn't going to let go of it. Nick Hale had faced ruthless negotiations, high-stakes deals, and impossible business challenges. But nothing had ever made him as nervous as this. Meeting his daughter for the first time, knowing who he was to her, terrified him in a way nothing else ever had. He stood at the park entrance, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, staring across the playground. The laughter of children filled the air, the crisp scent of autumn leaves mixed with the faint sweetness of cotton candy from a nearby vendor. And there she was, Lily. She was a little ball of energy, her dark curls bouncing as she ran across the grass, her small hands reaching out toward the sky, as if trying to catch the sunlight in her fingers. She was so full of life, so unbothered by the storm raging inside of him. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Nick held his breath. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she smiled. A simple, bright, trusting smile. And just like that, Nick's world tilted. Rose, standing a few feet away, gave him a cautious glance before gently nudging Lily forward. Go say hello, sweetheart, she encouraged. Lily hesitated for only a second before skipping toward him, stopping just short of his feet. You came, she said, tilting her head up at him. Nick swallowed hard. That balls all hard, forcing himself to smile past the tightness in his throat. I did, he said, his voice softer than usual. I told you I would. Lily studied him for a moment before reaching up, small fingers wrapping around his much larger hand. Nick nearly stopped breathing. The warmth of her tiny fingers against his palm sent a jolt through his entire body. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she held on to him like she had known him forever. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had worried she might hesitate, that she would be distant, that she would look at him like a stranger. Instead, she just accepted him. Nick swallowed the lump in his throat. Do you like swings? She asked suddenly, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. Nick blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, swings are great. Lily grinned. Then let's go. And just like that, she was tugging him forward, her little fingers gripping his like a lifeline. Nick let himself be pulled, completely powerless, against her. For the first time in his life, he was following, not leading. Nick sat down on the swing beside her, feeling strangely out of place. He wasn't used to this, to something so simple, so free. Lily, on the other hand, fit here effortlessly. She swung her legs, twisting the chains slightly before looking up at him expectantly. You said you'd bring a book, she reminded him. Nick chuckled, reaching into his coat pocket. He had almost forgotten about it. I did. He pulled out a small hardcover fairy tale book, one he had picked up after asking Rose what Lily liked. Lily gasped dramatically. Are there dragons? Nick smirked. Big ones. She clapped her hands together. Good. I like princesses who fight dragons, not the ones who just wait for princes. Nick chuckled. You're a smart kid. She beamed. Then, without hesitation, she scooted closer, pressing her shoulder against his as she leaned in to see the pages. And just like that, Nick realized something. Fatherhood wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about knowing all the right things to say or do. It was about being here, being present, being someone his daughter could count on. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and began to read. And for the first time, he felt like he belonged. Halfway through the story, Lily reached out again, tugging on his sleeve. You have a nice voice, she said matter-of-factly. Nick raised an eyebrow. Yeah? She nodded. Like a knight. You should be a knight. Nick let out a soft laugh. Knights fight dragons, you know? Lily grinned. That means you could be one. Nick swallowed hard. He had spent years believing he wasn't built for this, that he had no place in a child's world. But Lily, she had already decided. She had placed him in her story, without hesitation, without fear. And Nick Hale wasn't going to let her down. Know in the comments, like this story if you believe in the power of love and second chances. Subscribe for more emotional stories that will make you laugh, cry, and feel every moment. Nick Hale had closed multi-million-dollar deals, negotiated with the toughest CEOs, and built an empire from the ground up. He had sat in boardrooms filled with powerful men and women, controlled conversations with a single glance, and shaped his future exactly the way he wanted. But tonight, sitting in Rose's small, cozy apartment, watching his daughter color a picture at the coffee table, he felt completely out of his depth. The moment he stepped inside, he knew this world was nothing like his. The walls were adorned with framed photographs. Lily at the park, Lily in a princess dress, Lily laughing with Rose. A small bookshelf sat in the corner, stacked with children's books and a few well-worn novels. The kitchen was small but warm, filled with the scent of something rich and comforting. A stark contrast to the cold perfection of his penthouse where takeout containers and untouched gourmet meals were the norm. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a home, and it was a home he had never been a part of. He swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in his throat. Rose, standing by the stove, glanced at him before nodding toward the dining table. Make yourself comfortable, she said. her voice carefully neutral. Nick exhaled slowly and did as she said, but nothing about this felt comfortable. It felt like something he had lost before he even knew he wanted it. Lily, completely unfazed by his tension, skipped over and climbed onto a chair beside him. "Did you know Mommy makes the best spaghetti in the whole world?" she announced proudly, swinging her small legs. Nick smirked slightly, looking toward Rose. "Is that right?" Rose rolled her eyes. "I wouldn't say the best, but it's edible." Lily gasped dramatically. "Mommy, it's perfect." Nick chuckled, surprised at how easily she made him smile. "Then I guess I'm lucky to get a taste," he said. Lily grinned, clearly satisfied, before turning back to the coffee table where her crayons were spread out. "I'm making a drawing," she told him. "Want to see?" Nick leaned in, glancing at the paper. His heart stopped. 3 stick figures stood in a row, their hands joined. A little girl in the middle, a woman on one side, and a taller man on the other. A house was drawn in the background, and above them, a bright yellow sun. Lily pointed at each figure. "This is me," she said, tapping the small figure in the middle. "And this is Mommy." Then she tapped the last one. "And this is you." Nick inhaled sharply. She said it so easily, so naturally, as if it had always been the truth, as if he had always been here. Something lodged itself in his throat, something too heavy to swallow. "You drew me?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Lily nodded as if it were obvious. "Yeah, you're part of the family, right?" "Right." Nick didn't speak, because in her world it really was that simple. Rose was watching him. He could feel it. When he finally lifted his gaze, their eyes met, hers filled with something unreadable, something cautious, yet soft. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what had been missing. Nick looked back at Lily, still happily coloring, unaware of the emotional tidal wave she had just unleashed inside him. For 4 years, he had lived without this, without her. And now that he had seen what he had been missing, he knew he could never go back. Rose finally broke the silence. "Lily, go wash your hands before dinner," she said gently. Lily groaned but obeyed, skipping toward the bathroom. The room felt heavier the moment she was gone. Nick turned back to Rose, still feeling the weight of that drawing, still feeling the unspoken emotions pressing down on him. "She put me in the picture," he said, almost to himself. Rose exhaled slowly, setting down 2 plates on the table. "She sees you, Nick," she murmured. "Even if you weren't here before, she sees you now." Nick's fingers curled slightly against the table surface. "That's all that matters to her," Rose added. Nick looked at her then, really looked at her. She wasn't pushing him away anymore. For the first time, she was letting him in. When Lily returned, they ate dinner together. Not as strangers, not as 2 people separated by the past, but as something new, something still uncertain, but undeniably real. Nick listened as Lily talked nonstop, bouncing between stories about school, her favorite books, and the adventures of her stuffed animals. And for the first time in his life, Nick didn't care about the business calls he was missing. He didn't care about the emails piling up or the deals waiting to be closed. All he cared about was this, about her, about the way she smiled, the way her tiny hands gestured excitedly as she spoke, the way she looked at him as if he had always belonged here. And he wanted to be here. He needed to be here. He wasn't going anywhere. Nick Hale had built his empire on discipline, strategy, and control. He had spent years perfecting the art of negotiation, predicting outcomes before they even unfolded. But no amount of preparation had readied him for this. For the tiny 5-year-old girl who had effortlessly stepped into his life and rearranged everything. For the first time, Nick found himself in unfamiliar territory, not in the boardroom, not in the financial world, but in the small, everyday moments of fatherhood that he had never known existed. And he wouldn't trade them for anything. It started subtly. At first, their meetings had been planned, coordinated between him and Rose, structured like a business arrangement. He would pick Lily up, take her to the park, the bookstore, or the cafe where she loved the oversized cookies. Then, after a few hours, he would drop her off and return to his world of deadlines and numbers. But one evening, as he stepped into Rose's apartment to bring Lily home after a long day at work, something shifted. Lily was sitting on the couch wearing her pajamas, a well-loved stuffed unicorn in her arms. Her tiny fingers absent-mindedly played with the fabric of its mane. But the moment she saw Nick enter, she lit up. "You came," she whispered, her voice filled with something he didn't recognize at first. Something fragile, something hopeful. Nick froze. Had she thought he wouldn't? Had she been waiting all this time, unsure if he would show up? A painful lump formed in his throat as he crouched in front of her. "Of course I came," he said softly. "I'll always come, Lily." She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reached out, wrapping her small arms around his neck, pressing her face against his shoulder. Nick felt his chest tighten. She had hugged him before, quick and playful squeezes. But this was different. This was trust. This was relief. This was his daughter believing in him, and he would never give her a reason to doubt that again. From that night forward, everything changed. Lily no longer just expected him to show up. She needed him to. Each time they met, she would talk faster, laugh louder, pull him into her world without hesitation. One evening, he arrived at the apartment and found her waiting by the window. She bounced excitedly when she saw him, running straight to the door. "Nick, I learned a new dance today. Want to see?" Nick raised an eyebrow, amused. "A dance?" Lily nodded fiercely, then grabbed his hand. She pulled him into the living room, stepping onto the rug, lifting her arms dramatically before spinning in circles, her small feet barely keeping up with her enthusiasm. Nick clapped, his lips twitching into a smirk. "Impressive," he said, crouching to her level. "I think you're ready for Broadway." Lily gasped. "Really?" "Absolutely." She beamed, then paused, tilting her head. "Wait, what's Broadway?" Nick laughed. At first, Nick had tried to teach Lily things the way he handled business. By strategy, by precision, by calculated effort. But Lily had other ideas. One afternoon at the park, she tugged on his sleeve. "Push me higher," she said from the swing set, her legs kicking in excitement. Nick hesitated. "Are you sure you could fall?" Lily giggled. "You always say that." "That's because it's true." "But that's what makes it fun," she declared, leaning back, her hair catching in the wind. "You just have to trust me, Nick." Nick sighed, but his lips twitched as he gave the swing a gentle push. Lily squealed, laughing as she soared higher, completely fearless. Nick stood behind her, watching, feeling something foreign settle inside him. Maybe Lily was the one teaching him to let go, to take risks, not just in business, but in life, teaching him that sometimes falling wasn't the worst thing. One evening, Rose called him unexpectedly. "She won't sleep," she sighed over the phone. "I think she wants to talk to you." Nick frowned. "Me? She's been asking if you're coming tonight. I told her no, but she's still waiting." Nick didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, he was at their door, stepping inside as Lily peeked out from her bedroom. She yawned, rubbing her tired eyes. "You came," she whispered, sleepy but satisfied. Nick felt his chest ache. He walked over, lifting her into his arms, carrying her back to bed. Lily curled into his shoulder, small and warm, completely trusting. "Can you read me a story?" she mumbled. Nick glanced at Rose, who simply shook her head with a quiet chuckle. "Good luck getting out of this one." Nick sat on the edge of her bed, reaching for one of her books. As he read, his voice steady and low, Lily's eyes grew heavier, her tiny hand resting against his sleeve. And for the first time in his life, Nick Hale, the ruthless businessman, the man who had never let anyone get close, stayed. Stayed until Lily's breathing evened out. Stayed because he wanted to. Stayed because he couldn't imagine not being here anymore. Nick never expected this. Never expected that a 5-year-old girl with messy curls and his blue eyes would undo everything he had built. That she would take his cold, calculated world and fill it with laughter, warmth, and something even more terrifying. Love. He had spent his entire life chasing power, success, control. And now he realized none of it mattered if he didn't have this, if he didn't have her. And so as he closed the storybook and pressed a gentle kiss to Lily's forehead, Nick Hale made a promise to himself. He wasn't just going to be a part of her life, he was going to be the father she deserved. Nick Hale had spent years running from emotions. He had buried himself in work, in success, in a life that left no room for regrets or personal connections. But now, standing in Rose's small but warm apartment, watching his daughter arrange her stuffed animals in a perfect row, he realized something startling. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. and he wasn't alone. Lily was his daughter. And Rose, the woman who had once walked away, who had once taken his chance at fatherhood, was standing by the kitchen counter, watching him as if she still wasn't sure if he would stay. It happened unexpectedly, the night everything changed. Lily had fallen asleep in his arms on the couch, her tiny fingers curled into his shirt. Nick had sat there for nearly half an hour, just listening to her soft breathing, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile peace had settled between them. Rose, who had been cleaning up in the kitchen, finally sighed and approached him. "She's out," she whispered, careful not to wake Lily. "Let me put her to bed." Nick hesitated. "I'll do it." Rose froze. It was such a simple offer, but something about the way he said it, the quiet conviction, the absolute certainty that he wanted to do this, made something flicker in her eyes. She nodded slowly, stepping aside as Nick carefully lifted Lily into his arms. She barely stirred, her head resting against his shoulder as he carried her to her room, tucking her beneath the covers. For a long moment, he just stood there. He had never put a child to bed before, never had this moment. The stillness, the quiet love of simply being there. His chest ached. How many nights like this had he missed? How many bedtimes had gone by without him? And why had it taken so long for him to get here? When Nick walked back out to the living room, Rose was waiting. She was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Nick realized how exhausted she looked. Not just tired from the day, but tired from years of carrying this weight alone. The weight of raising Lily on her own. The weight of keeping this secret. And maybe the weight of wondering if she had done the right thing. Nick exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "We need to talk," he said finally. Rose nodded. "I know." They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick and unforgiving. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Rose let out a breath. "I never wanted to hurt you." Nick's jaw tightened. "Then why did you do it?" Rose flinched, because even if he wasn't yelling, his voice carried more weight than any anger ever could. She looked down at her hands. "I was scared, Nick," she admitted. "Back then you were so untouchable. You were rising so fast, taking every opportunity. I told myself I was doing the right thing by not telling you, that I was sparing you from a choice you didn't need to make." Nick's hands curled into fists. "That wasn't your choice to make, Rose." Her breath hitched, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. The admission hit harder than he expected, because for the first time, she wasn't defending her actions. She was regretting them. And that made it impossible for him to hold on to the fury that had burned inside him for so long. Because hadn't he done the same? Hadn't he spent years telling himself he didn't need love, didn't need family? Hadn't he believed he was better off alone? The truth was, they had both been scared. They had both run from what they didn't understand. And now they were both trying to make up for lost time. Nick exhaled heavily, shaking his head. "I missed 4 years, Rose." "I know. I missed everything." His voice broke slightly, and he hated how vulnerable it made him feel. Her first words, her first steps, her birthdays, I wasn't there. Rose's lips trembled. "I know." His chest ached, but then he looked at her, really looked at her, at the dark circles beneath her eyes, at the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of her own regrets, at the way she had done this alone for so long. And something inside him shifted. Nick reached across the table, hesitating for only a second before covering her hand with his. Rose sucked in a breath. He had never touched her like this before, not with anger, not with resentment, but with understanding. "I can't change the past," he said softly. "Neither can you." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "But I'm here now, Rose." His fingers tightened. "And I'm not going anywhere." She blinked rapidly, her throat working as if she were trying to keep herself from falling apart. And then finally she nodded. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, the weight between them began to lift. That night, Nick didn't leave right away. They sat in the living room talking about Lily, about who she was, what she loved, what she dreamed of. Rose told him about the first time Lily had tried to bake cookies and nearly set the kitchen on fire. Nick laughed. really laughed, because he could already picture it. They weren't fixed. They weren't magically healed, but they were trying, and that was something. When he finally stood to leave, Rose walked him to the door. Nick hesitated before turning back to her. You were right about one thing, he admitted. Rose raised an eyebrow. Oh? You told me back then that I was too focused on my career to have a family. He let out a slow breath. Maybe you were right. Maybe if I had known about Lily back then, I wouldn't have been ready. Rose's expression softened. But I'm ready now, he said firmly. Something flickered in her eyes. She nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him pass. Good night, Nick. He gave her a small, tired smile. Good night, Rose. As he walked to his car, something settled inside him. For the first time in years, the anger was gone. He wasn't just trying to be Lily's father anymore. He was becoming one. And somehow that made all the difference. Nick Hale had spent years measuring his worth by numbers, revenue, investments, the rise and fall of stock prices. He had built an empire, a legacy that carried his name, a reputation that made men fear him in the boardroom. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was just a father. He stood in the doorway of Lily's bedroom, watching as Rose sat beside their daughter, her voice soft and warm as she read a bedtime story. The glow of the bedside lamp cast golden light across the room, making it feel impossibly small, impossibly intimate. Nick had always believed that silence was a weakness, that stillness meant stagnation. But in this moment, he found peace in the quiet. Lily clutched her favorite stuffed bunny to her chest, her wide blue eyes fluttering as sleep tugged at her. She looked safe, loved, happy. And for the first time in years, Nick realized he had been chasing the wrong things. Nick had spent so long running from emotions, drowning himself in work, convincing himself that love was a distraction he couldn't afford. He had told himself that success required sacrifice, that power meant standing alone. But what had it really cost him? 4 years. 4 years of missed bedtimes, missed birthdays, missed first words and first steps. He clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tightening against the emotions threatening to rise. He had spent a lifetime controlling every outcome, planning every move, but he had never anticipated this feeling of deep, aching regret. Because no matter how much money he made, no matter how many deals he closed, he could never buy back the time he had lost with his daughter. And that thought shattered him. As Rose finished the story, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead. Good night, baby, she whispered. Lily yawned, snuggling deeper into her blankets. Night, Mommy. Then to Nick's surprise, she turned her sleepy gaze toward him. Night, Daddy. Nick froze. He wasn't sure if she had ever called him that before. Not fully, not so naturally. Something in his chest tightened, and he forced himself to swallow past the lump in his throat. Good night, sweetheart, he murmured. He didn't move as Rose stood, carefully tucking the blanket around Lily before she walked toward him. As they stepped out of the room, Rose paused, watching him carefully. Nick hadn't realized he was still standing there, still staring at Lily like she might disappear if he looked away. You okay? Rose asked softly. He let out a slow, measured breath before finally tearing his gaze away. I've never been more okay in my life, he admitted, because at that moment he knew. Success wasn't about power. It wasn't about wealth. It was this, being here, being a father. And he would never walk away from them again. Later that night, as he stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline, Nick reflected on how much his life had changed. A month ago, he had been a man who believed he had everything. Tonight, he knew he had been missing everything that truly mattered. A warmth settled in his chest, not the rush of a business victory, not the thrill of closing a major deal, but something deeper, something real, love, family, a purpose greater than himself, and this time, he wouldn't let it slip through his fingers. Nick Hale had spent most of his life believing that success was about control, about power. He had built an empire, led corporations, and made decisions that shaped industries. But standing in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, watching her sleep peacefully, he finally understood the truth. Success wasn't about wealth or power, it was about moments like this, the quiet ones, the real ones, the ones he had almost missed. For years, he had convinced himself that emotions were a liability, that love made a man weak. But now, as he looked at his daughter, he knew love wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. Nick had spent weeks trying to make up for lost time, learning Lily's favorite bedtime stories, cooking breakfast with her on Sunday mornings, sitting on the floor with crayons and letting her draw princess armor on his expensive suits. He had been afraid at first, afraid that she wouldn't accept him, that the damage had already been done. But Lily, in her innocent wisdom, had welcomed him into her heart without hesitation. To her, he wasn't just some powerful businessman. He was her dad, and nothing else mattered. But there was another part of his life he needed to fix, Rose. He had spent so much time resenting her for keeping Lily a secret, but the more time he spent with their daughter, the more he realized why she had done it. She had been scared, alone, and she had done what she thought was best. And despite everything, she had given Lily a beautiful life. So one evening, as they sat together on the porch of Rose's apartment while Lily played in the yard, Nick finally said the words that had been weighing on his heart. "I forgive you." Rose turned to him, surprised. "Nick, no, listen." He took a deep breath. "I was angry, and I had every right to be, but I also know I wasn't the man you needed back then. And I hate that I wasn't there, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Rose swallowed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time in years, they weren't just two people burdened by the past. They were two parents building a future together. Weeks turned into months. Nick didn't just visit Lily on weekends. He became a permanent part of her life. He helped with school projects. He sat through ballet recitals, even when he didn't understand a thing about dance. He even learned how to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches the way Lily liked them, with the crust cut off and shaped into a heart. And with each passing day, something became clearer. He wasn't just being a father. He was learning how to love, and not just Lily. Rose. They had started off awkwardly, trying to navigate their new reality. But slowly, something changed. The stolen glances, the quiet laughter, the late-night talks, they all led to something undeniable. Love, real, unshakable, undeniable. And this time, Nick didn't run from it. Nick Hale had spent his life chasing a definition of success that had left him empty. But now he knew the truth. Success isn't about money. It isn't about power. It's about the people who love you. Because at the end of the day, money can't buy happiness. But love is priceless. So take a moment today to appreciate the people who matter most. Tell them you love them. Show up. Be present. Because time is the one thing you can never get back. What did you think of Nick's journey? Let us know in the comments. Like this story if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.